Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into how a single, highly localized political assassination exploded into the most industrialized, technologically brutal conflict humanity had ever seen. We're talking about the Great War, a conflict that fundamentally rewired the modern world as we know it. So, the core mystery we're tackling today is this. How did the death of just one man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in the summer of 1914, trigger a global chain reaction of unprecedented mechanized warfare? Well, it wasn't magic, and it certainly wasn't an accident. It was the result of a perfectly primed system that was just begging to detonate. To answer that, we'll map out this complex history in 5 quick steps. First, the European powder keg. Second, the alliance chain reaction. Third, the trench stalemate. Fourth, the technological arms race. And finally, the 100 Days Offensive.
All right, part 1, the European powder keg. The crucial thing to understand is that Europe in 1914 was absolutely not at peace. It might have looked calm on the surface, but underneath, it was a tightly coiled spring, heavily armed, deeply divided, and essentially waiting for an excuse to strike.
You've probably heard of the acronym MAIN. Well, these 4 pillars created an atmosphere of intense hostility. You had rising nationalism, like the Serbian desire to break free from Austro-Hungarian rule. You had imperialism, with nations fiercely competing for overseas colonies. Then there's militarism, beautifully illustrated by the intense Anglo-German naval arms race. And finally, rival alliances that split the continent into 2 heavily armed camps. At this point, nations genuinely believed that war was a completely acceptable first recourse for a dispute.
And that right there is exactly why historians call the continent a powder keg during this time. I mean, the explosive was packed tight. Between the military buildup and these rigid you jump, I jump treaties, if one nation went to war, everybody was going to war.
Moving on to part 2, the alliance chain reaction. Let's see what actually happens when that inevitable spark finally hits in the summer of 1914. June 28, 1914. A Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, this was the catalyst, but because of those rigid, intertwined alliance systems we just talked about, it couldn't just stay a localized internal issue between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. No way. Just look at how wildly fast this domino effect happened. In barely over a month, we go from a single assassination to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. That pulls in Russia to protect Serbia. Germany then activates its Schlieffen Plan, preemptively declaring war on Russia and France. And when Germany invades neutral Belgium to get to France, boom, Britain jumps in. And because these are empires, they drag their massive overseas territories with them. The whole world is plunged into war in a matter of days.
Okay, part 3, the trench stalemate. So, the war is a global reality now. Armies marched off to the front lines genuinely expecting a quick, glorious victory. They literally thought it would be over by Christmas, but they were met with a horrifying surprise.
All that fancy political maneuvering in the grand halls of Europe, over. It was entirely replaced by the grim, agonizing reality of millions of soldiers bogged down in defensive mud and trench warfare. The fast-paced mobile war they planned for violently ground to a halt.
It was an absolutely catastrophic mismatch. Generals were essentially throwing 19th century tactics, like literal open-field infantry charges, right into the teeth of 20th century tech. Imagine rows of soldiers charging directly at belt-fed Max machine guns, getting tangled up in vast, impenetrable fields of barbed wire, and being obliterated by massive indirect artillery. This clash of old tactics and modern weapons is what led directly to that brutal, bloody deadlock. Which brings us to part 4, the technological arms race. Because head-on attacks were now practically a death sentence, both sides desperately poured every ounce of their industrial might into inventing new, frankly terrifying ways to break the stalemate. First deployed by Germany at Ypres in 1915, poison gas was a terrifying new frontier. I mean, this was despite being banned by previous Hague conventions. Chlorine, mustard, and phosgene gases actively attacked the respiratory systems of soldiers hiding out in bunkers. And this forced a hyper-fast evolution in chemical countermeasures. At first, troops were literally trying to survive using urine-soaked rags over their faces, which, thankfully, were eventually replaced by formal, mass-produced gas masks.
Now take a look at this number, 93. Just take a second and guess what that represents in the context of this war.
It's the average life expectancy of a British pilot on the Western Front in April 1917, just 93 flying hours. Unbelievable, right? The air war went from these slow, unarmed observation balloons used for spotting into deadly, high-speed dogfights. This really kicked off after they invented interrupter gears, which is what allowed planes to fire synchronized machine guns directly through their own spinning propellers without shooting them off.
Meanwhile, back on the ground, artillery completely transformed from simple direct line-of-sight firing to complex indirect bombardments. They were using spotter aircraft, field telephones, and some seriously sophisticated math regarding weather and barrel wear to invent the creeping barrage. This meant a literal curtain of explosive shells would land directly in front of advancing infantry, moving forward step by step to provide moving cover.
And this tech race wasn't contained to the land and air. It went straight beneath the waves as the battle to control global supply lines raged. Germany unleashed U-boats in unrestricted submarine warfare to literally starve Britain out. In response, the Allies had to invent brand new naval technologies on the fly, things like depth charges, underwater hydrophones that eventually led to sonar, and heavily armed decoy vessels called Q-ships.
But perhaps the most iconic innovation of the whole war was the tank. British engineers essentially mashed up the internal combustion engine with heavy armor plating and caterpillar tracks. They designed these massive, rhomboidal beasts specifically to crush impenetrable barbed wire and physically cross 8-foot-wide enemy trenches in a desperate bid to get the battlefield moving again.
Even down at the squad level, the tools of the individual soldier completely transformed. Warfare shifted away from simple bolt-action rifles to devastating tools of close-quarters trench clearing. We see the Lewis gun, the first true light machine gun you could actually walk with, brutal pump-action trench shotguns, flamethrowers to clear bunkers, and a massive reliance on explosives. We're talking everything from formal Mills bombs to improvised grenades packed with dynamite and shrapnel inside empty jam tins.
Finally, Part 5, the 100 Days Offensive. Let's look at how all this chaotic, brand-new tactical tech we just went over was finally coordinated in the war's climactic push.
Now, a quick reality check here. While these new machines were revolutionary, they were still incredibly primitive and prone to breaking down constantly during major pushes. For instance, at the Battle of Amiens late in the war, mechanical difficulties actually disabled more British tanks than enemy fire did.
Yet despite the mechanical hiccups, the overall combined arms strategy finally clicked. By layering infantry infiltration tactics, mathematically precise creeping barrages, hundreds of tanks, and close air support all at once, the Allies shattered the trench lines. They achieved astonishing mobility during the 100 Days Offensive, advancing 13 kilometers on the first day alone, a distance that literally would have taken years to cross just a few months prior.
Ultimately, it was this complete, brutal industrialization of warfare that forced an end to the horrific attrition. Exhausted, outsupplied, and facing an enemy that had finally mastered mechanized tactics, the Central Powers collapsed, leading to the armistice on November 11, 1918.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. The rigid alliances and the powder keg of 1914 dragged the world into the mud. But the desperate struggle to escape that mud is what birthed the tank, the bomber, the light machine gun, and the submarine. Knowing that, how did this so-called war to end all wars actually just lay the mechanized, technological groundwork for the rest of the devastating 20th century? Think about it. Thanks for exploring this with me today.